Good evening, everybody, and welcome to webinar 41. Tonight we are talking about moral injury, and we're joined by guests from Forward Assist and Salute Her. So while the room's just filling up, I will let you know that tonight does have the potential to be quite a sensitive topic. So if you do need to step away, that's absolutely fine. If you do need to watch it back and stop watching tonight, that's fine as well. We just want you to look after yourself. We want you to get involved as much as you can, but it is really important that you do look after yourself. So it's webinar 31. 41. We have 117 people, which that went up really fast. So tonight, I know that you say that I just ask you what you've had for your tea, and I don't. I think I did it once. But what I will ask you is where in the world you are. Are you a social worker? Are you a student? Are you a practice educator? Tell us kind of what field of work you're in, and if you like, tell us what you've had for your tea. So the team have had a good laugh at me because I've had a crisp butty. I'm from Manchester, so that's what I call it. If you do like crisp sandwiches, tell us what are the best crisps to put on a sandwich. If you don't like crisp sandwiches, then I'm not sure we can be friends. So Siobhan, I'm going to hand over to you now while I read the rest of the chat and get some recipes from my next dinner. So over to you.
I just think it a full-on recipe of a crisp sandwich, frazzles with brown sauce. I mean, I'd never have even thought of that. It's just like, I mean, we're going to get Nigella Lawson contacting us about sandwich recipes, aren't we, for crisps? So good evening to everybody. I can see numbers are still going up, but we are going to make a start because there is such a lot for us to get through tonight. So as Kelly said, this is our 41st webinar. It's actually not the first time in our webinars that we've spoken about moral injury. We did actually refer to moral injury in our third webinar, so really early on in our webinars when we were talking about how theory related to working in the pandemic. I mentioned that I'd kind of just heard about moral injury. I was just starting to think about how moral injury might apply to social workers, and many people I know remember that Kat shared with us an example of her own moral injury as a student social worker, and so you might want to watch that one back if you didn't see it first time. But Kat's example has really stayed with me ever since, and since that time I've done a huge amount of work on moral injury. There's pretty much every week I'm doing 5 or 6 sessions a week with social workers talking about moral injury. I'm either delivering something around moral injury and how to take care of ourselves, or I'm doing reflective sessions with people who are experiencing moral injury. So we thought that we would like to revisit this as a topic, but rather than me deliver the whole session tonight, I'm just going to do a bit of an introduction around, I suppose, how I think moral injury applies to us as social workers, or to students, or to newly qualified social workers. But then we're going to be joined by some amazing guests who are going to tell us about moral injury from a different perspective. And so I think it's going to be a very smooth session, but actually with a lot of different things for you to take away. But as Kelly said, there could be some things tonight that could be difficult for you, either in what I present or in what Tony and Paula present later. And if you do want some support, then you know our email address. You can contact us via our email address, which the guys will put into the chat now, and we will make sure that there is some support for you as well if that's necessary. So we're going to be talking about moral injury. We're going to look at, I suppose, just to start off with, well, what is moral injury? Maybe you've not heard of it when you've come to the session tonight. So in terms of what moral injury is and how it might apply to us as social workers, then it comes originally from the military. That's where it comes from. And in the military, moral injury refers to the psychological distress that results either from taking actions or perhaps a lack of actions that violate your moral code. Now, in social work, we wouldn't tend to talk about our morals. We would talk more about our ethics or our values. So when I've been talking about moral injury as it might impact on us as social workers, I have thought about, well, should I change it? Should I call it something else? Should we call it, I don't know, an ethical injury? I have heard some people talking about ethical distress, which I think is it's similar, but I don't think it's the same. And I've stuck to using the phrase moral injury, because although it comes originally from the military, it is now being used much more widely. You might have even seen there was an article in The Guardian this weekend about moral injury of NHS staff. There's been a lot on the BBC News about moral injury for NHS workers. So it's a concept that's been around for a long time, actually, when you look at it. But the links to occupation and the way that we can see it today comes from the work of Jonathan Shea more than 20 years ago, when he was working with Vietnam veterans. Now, I'm saying this from my perspective, and Tony might have a different view on it, you know, as from a military perspective, but just my reading around it and thinking about how it applies to us as social workers. So I first came across it in an article in the British Medical Journal very early in the pandemic. I think it was actually March last year, and it was more of a speculative article by Greenberg et al. And they were speculating about healthcare professionals. Now, they said that they thought, and again, you know, it was before the pandemic really impacted on the NHS and on us in the UK. So it was a speculative article, but they speculated that healthcare professionals were going to be at significant risk of moral injury during the pandemic because of three things. Because they said that healthcare workers would need to think about how to allocate scant resources to what they described as equally needy patients. That's their wording, not my wording. Because they would need to think about how to balance their own physical and healthcare needs with those of their patients. And because they were going to need to make decisions about how to align their duty of care towards patients with their duty towards their own family network. And straight away, it captured me, because I was thinking, you know, this is actually something that social workers are dealing with all the time. We're always thinking about how do we allocate scant resources to people in equal need. We're always thinking about how do we balance our own need for self-care with the fact that we're there to support others. We're always thinking about how do we make these decisions, you know, when there are so many different dilemmas involved. So I was thinking this is something that's going to apply to us as social workers. I got interested in it. I wrote some blogs about it. You know, people really started to get in touch with me regularly about their own experiences of this. And I've really started to think about this as a concept that social workers have to be familiar with. I'm now starting to meet with, in some local authorities, senior managers around how this is going to be addressed as we start to hopefully come out of the pandemic, but begin to recognise the impact of moral injury on staff. It's not just, from my perspective, about what we're doing as social workers in the pandemic. It's also about where we're doing it. So I think the impact of working from home is actually adding to the risks of moral injury for social workers, because we know, don't we, that trauma and space are connected together. You know, that phrase that gets used in society, do you remember where you were when you heard about such and such a thing? We're very clear that trauma and space are connected together. And at the moment, many of us are bringing social work into our own homes, into our families, and we've got to think about how do we avoid some of that secondary trauma, all that stuff that we listen to every day. How do we make sure that it doesn't impact on our families, that it doesn't impact in our homes? Because we know, and we've talked about many times in these webinars, that there is a limit at the moment in terms of situated learning and situated support. So, you know, that stuff about when you're in a busy office, you're sitting there, you overhear telephone conversations and you think, well, I really like the way they did that, I'll do that. You learn from being in a busy office. Likewise, if you have a very difficult telephone call, you know, perhaps somebody says, I'm going to hold you personally responsible for this, or whatever the call is, and there's a lot of conflict on this call, people in the office will hear that and they'll come and say, that sounded like a tough call. Do you want to have a cup of tea? Do you want to talk about it? But when you're sitting at home and you take that call, you put the phone down, there's no one to talk to. You're not supposed to talk to the people that are at home about the difficulties of work because of issues around confidentiality. So what are we doing? Where are we getting support from? Yeah, I'm hearing from students, just last week I was hearing from students who are living in halls and are really finding some of the work that they're doing on placement and some of the trauma that they're listening to incredibly difficult to manage in that halls type environment. So we've really got to think about not just what we're doing, not just the pandemic, but also where we're doing it at the moment. And I believe very strongly that our employers and our educators have a responsibility to support us as social workers and as students in creating reflective and emotionally safe working spaces for ourselves. I think that's really key. And I'm going to share with you now some of the things that people have said to me over the last 12 months or so in sessions. Now, some of these are very specific. I could tell you the individual that said it on exactly what day, you know, it's a very specific individual. Some of them are more generic, the kinds of things that people are saying to me. Clearly, I'm not going to identify individuals, but I could, you know, some of them are very individual, some are much more generic. And as I say some of these to you, it could ring true. These are some of the things that maybe be triggering for people around your own experiences. So do, as Kelly said, do make sure that you look after yourselves as you're listening to this. But these are some of the things that social workers and students are telling me about working in the middle of a global pandemic. There was a hospice social worker who I think had been a social worker in hospice care for 20 years who said, here I am doing death and dying at my kitchen table. And that really caught me, because that's what made me really think it's not just what we're doing, it's where we're doing it. You know, people who are saying to me, I don't know how tall they are. I've only ever seen them online. You know, I don't know how tall my colleagues are. And that's really struck me. There's been that a few times with different people. That's really struck me about when you're new somewhere. I remember saying to someone, they were about 6 months in, and I said, you know the person, I mean, they're the really tall person. And she said, I don't know how tall anyone is. I've only seen them online. And that really made me think about, actually, we don't know each other. And we as a team, all of us have just had conversations about how tall we are and things. We've worked together for a year now, but we've never physically met, you know, and that has an impact on the kind of support you can get from one another. Lots of people saying things like, I'm doing what I can, but it's never going to be enough. And I keep on asking myself, how am I ever going to get over all of this? Students saying, how are you supposed to learn about your profession sitting in your bedroom in the middle of a global pandemic? You know, just watching it online isn't enough. Lots of adult social care practitioners really struggling with supporting people to move into residential care. And one that really stands out for me was a woman who said, she supported a woman to move into a residential care setting. And she said, you know, I'm haunted by what I did. They were married for 72 years and they never saw each other again after my intervention. I mean, that's a huge thing to carry as a social worker. People saying, I feel like my home's been invaded. You know, when it's all over, I never want to come into this room again. You know, people feeling like their home's been invaded. People saying, I feel abandoned by social work leadership. Hospital social worker, one hospital social worker who said she took a day off on the Monday because she was exhausted. And people are talking about exhaustion, really, and emotional exhaustion. She said, I took Monday off because I was exhausted. I came in Tuesday morning, I'd been allocated 20 new cases. But by the end of that day, I closed 17 of those because they died. A team manager who said she did an admin task every month and it was just about case closure. She had to close cases and say the reason for closure. And she said, I was sitting at my computer, closing case after case, clicking on the reason as death. And I realized that tears were rolling down my face. This was an admin task, but I sat there with tears rolling down my face. People saying it's loss after loss. How are you supposed to process it all? At the start, I felt helpless, and now I just feel hopeless. I'm hearing so much from people that they're feeling lost in terms of hope. And when we lose hope, that is clearly moral injury. And this whole idea of moral injury coming from the military, and we're going to hear the military perspective later from Tony and Paula, but, you know, people saying it feels like a war zone and we've just got to keep on battling. We almost feel like we're in that war ourselves. So moral injury, you know, social work, how are we connecting it together? In many ways, it is similar to things that we are already familiar with in social work, like we talk about compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma or burnout. But we don't expect students or newly qualified workers to experience those things. These are things that normally would be much later in your career, but we do know, I know, that students and newly qualified workers are experiencing moral injury at a really alarming rate. We know from literature that people who develop moral injuries are likely to experience negative thoughts about themselves or others. Feelings of shame, guilt, or disgust are common. I know that Tony on Twitter has regularly throughout the pandemic been sharing a quote about moral injury that has really struck me about how it gets to your soul. And I think it really does. It impacts on practice and morale. In my opinion, it's going to negatively impact on analysis and decision making and other core practice skills. And I think this is going to have a real kind of legacy effect on us as a professional group, and something that we've got to explore as a profession. And the Awareness Therapy Centre, who have been doing a lot of work with NHS staff on moral injury, they say the symptoms of moral injury can manifest in changes in sleep patterns, in significant or persistent changes in behaviour or habits, mistakes being made, people seeking to isolate themselves even further, compulsive behaviour. But key, I think, for us as social workers, a weakened sense of empathy or compassion. And that's how it begins then to be linked in to compassion fatigue. Now, I've become fascinated by this over the last 12 months and what we can do about it. There is very little research in social work and moral injury. There's a few articles, but they're all about social workers working with veterans who are experiencing moral injury, as opposed to thinking about how we might be experiencing moral injury. There's some new research, I think, being undertaken. I think I heard some University of Southampton are doing some research for social work and moral injury, but there's very limited stuff on our own experience. But what we do know from the research is that there are 6 things that can really help to mitigate the impact of moral injury. Firstly, a sense that you belong to a strong community of practice, so that you're working as part of a team. And of course, that's challenging because we're all very individually based at the moment. A strong reflective culture which is supported at every level within the organisation, and also a sense that you're being listened to within that culture in the organisation. Good quality, emotionally supportive, reflective supervision. The opportunity for in-depth reflection with a particular focus on feelings and emotions is important. Education about the potential of moral injury. I mean, how many of us as social workers have heard of moral injury, have heard of how it applies to veterans, and thought about how it might then apply to us? Not many. So it's really important to have education about the potential for this, and a permission, if you like, to talk about it and explore the depth of any injury you experience with your colleagues, and a clear recognition of the importance of the work that you do and value being placed on your work are also important. So I would love to talk loads more about how this might be impacting on us, but I think that there is an awful lot to learn just from me just skimming the surface of what moral injury means in the military. I've really learned a lot that I can take into my own work, and there are blogs, you know, when we send you the follow-up email, I'll send you a link to the blog that I've written on moral injury, and we'll talk more about moral injury in the future as it applies to us, if this is something that you want to do. But I want you to be, I suppose, aware there is some good news around moral injury, certainly in terms of how it might impact on us. This might be different for veterans, and Tony might tell us this, but the Awareness Therapy Centre, who I mentioned earlier, they say this, and for me this is really important because I have started to become concerned about the long-term legacy of this on the profession, but this is very important for me. So the Awareness Therapy Centre say long-term negative consequences of morally injurious events are not inevitable. Although exact data isn't available, it's likely that most workers who experience morally injurious events will not have long-term negative outcomes. In fact, after potentially morally injurious experiences, some people even eventually develop a redefined meaning in life. And with time and support, they begin to incorporate the experience into growth or helping others. So that's good news in terms of the longer term consequences, if you like. And then the final thing that I'm going to say around moral injury comes actually I feel like it's my words really, but it's not my words. It comes from a blog written by Murray, who again does a lot of work in the NHS around moral injury. And she says this, she says, the best support that we can offer right now is honest, open conversations so that people can feel heard and validated in their experience. And that is what's going to help to get them through. Once we're through it, there will be different work to do. Whenever I've spoken about moral injury, she says, there have always been people in the audience who've breathed a huge sigh of relief because there's a name for the way that they're feeling. And that's totally my experience. People feel, okay, other people are experiencing this, I'm not alone. It's no different now. We really need to find ways to talk about how we're feeling, both the good and the bad, so that we can bear it. And for me, this is perhaps the most important sentence of the whole presentation I've done so far. She says, it's silence that will do the harm, not talking. And I think that's really important. You know, not talking about this doesn't mean it's going to go away. We need to talk about it. It might be painful to talk about, but we need to talk about the difficult stuff that we're doing as social workers and how it might be impacting on us in terms of moral injury. But I'm going to hand over, that's a quick introduction to the way that I've been looking at moral injury as it applies to us as a profession. But I'm going to hand over most of the webinar tonight to Tony and Paula, who are joining us from Forward Assist and Salute Her. And I first met Tony at the Social Worker of the Year Awards. It's a good couple of years ago now, Tony, I think, but we very fortunately just ended up sitting next to each other on a table and got chatting. And I was fascinated by the fact that, you know, here I am sitting next to a social worker who set up an organisation to support people that no one else in social work was supporting. And actually that whole idea of setting something up yourself when you see that skills and things are missing and that social work can bring something was fascinating to me. So Tony and Paula are going to join us and tell us about their work, and I think we can learn a lot about moral injury from that in terms of work with veterans. So I'm just going to hand over to you now, Tony, and you're going to hopefully take us through things, you and Paula.
Brilliant. Well, if that's wonderful, and first of all, thank you for inviting Paula and I. We're going to, so the charity Forward Assist was established by me. So after 6 years of working in a variety of social work settings, one of the key things I noticed was people struggled with that transition from military service back to civilian life. And so the charity I set up is specifically designed to help people make that transition, which is a physical as well as a psychological transition. But what I'm going to do today in regards to moral injury, next slide please, is I'm going to take you through, how do I do this is the best way to do it. Oh, there we are, wonderful. I'm going to take you through who we are, and then a little bit of research we've done into a hidden population, a population that doesn't really have a voice currently in the UK. It does around other countries such as America, Canada, Australia, but I'm talking about women veterans, and we've carried out some research into women veterans that raises all the issues around moral injury, and I'll make the correlation between that and quite surprisingly the trauma they're experienced in the military, which is around military sexual trauma is the term. But I'll get to that in a minute. But so my background is I've been a social worker for far too many years, and I think one of the wonderful things for me was when I left the military, I was going, right, who am I? Who am I? What am I going to do now? Where am I in life? And it was only when I got qualified as a social worker that I was able to accept I'd reinvented myself and had a new identity. And I'm really pleased to say that one of the opportunities being a social work gives you is there's so many different ways and different angles you can dedicate your life to supporting and helping people. And I chose to work with veterans who were returning from the military and struggling to cope. And so that's where we are. Next slide. So Paula came on board a couple of years ago. She's a qualified mental health therapist, and she leads our Women Veterans program, which I started 10 years ago. of which I was at an absolute disadvantage, being that I'm a man. So we really need to get a woman who could understand the needs of women and would identify with women. And in the last 2 years, we've got up there, she's engaged over 250 women veterans. But that's not true. Over the lockdown, it's been extraordinary because we went virtual and we've got over 600 women now engaging with our service. And Paula does a lot of group work with virtual group work one-to-one, and it's been extraordinary. And I'm sure she'll talk about that later on as we get into her part of the presentation. So the next stage is, as we move on, is basically we're a registered charity. We're based in the northeast of England, but geographically that doesn't matter anymore because since we went virtual, our geographic footprint is the whole of the UK, Europe and America, and somebody in Canada and a few people in Germany. So again, this has really sort of upped our reach, if you like, and it's been extraordinary. There's a few things there where the areas of work where we look at research, and in our case it's ethnographic research, education, advocacy and psychosocial support. And we look at trying to address the multiple complex needs of military veterans. We work in a building that's got teams of multidisciplinary health workers, social workers, doctors, you name it, they're all in one place. And that means we're able to connect people to the communities and the services they need very quickly. But the key bit for any veteran leaving the military, and I don't care if you were in 1 day or you're in 35 years, the issues you will encounter are around identity, transition, adjustment and assimilation. And so we've adopted a social work model, which works perfectly with our client group, which is all about case management, care coordination. And the women veterans does the same, but is very much trauma focused. And we've also set up international exchanges because when it comes to women veterans, the best practice is sadly abroad. Next slide, please. We've also, this is really postcards from the edge really, but it's like we've adopted this model which was used by OTs in Toronto, and it's a quality of life model, and it's based around being, belonging, becoming. So if you're thinking about the life of the veteran who's transitioning from military service to civilian life, the idea of being like, who are you, you know what I mean, you belong in, which groups do you belong to now, have you joined a club, do you go to church, what do you do? And the becoming bit is the really bit I love about this, because that's the aspirational element, because a lot of care planning doesn't really have an aspirational bit in it other than let's see if we can get you a little bit better than you were when you first engaged us. And this is a model we're using to sort of measure the progress made by individuals during the course of the time they're with us. So I think we're going to fly into the next bit. So forward and forward assist are almost like brother and sister here. Salute will become a charity in its own right, simply because the needs and demands of that are huge. And I think that should be a women-only service, actually. So I'm looking forward for when Salute Her actually gets its own wings and flies off and becomes its own charity, and Forward Assist will keep doing what it's always done and probably been a little bit more community based and work with men, probably more than women, and we'll work together, but we'll just refer into Salute Her. Next. Right. This is a really good point here. We use the term, a lot of people, if you speak of military terms, talk about female veterans. We don't do that. It's a matter of respect. We talk about women veterans, because if you talk about the word female, it's basically got your biological overtones. And we don't think when we're talking about human beings and people with lived experiences. So we call them women because because we respect women, and it describes them as a human, and the issues that they experience and the difficulties that face are very human experiences. So we change that. So throughout the course of our presentation, we'll talk a lot about women veterans. Occasionally there might be a slip up of female veterans, but in the main it'll be women veterans. So let me just explain. Women veterans in the UK are a hidden population. There is very, very little interventions designed by the service charity sector for women, and they have been for considerable time under the radar, would be the best way to describe the issues of women. And if you try to visualize a picture of a woman veteran, you probably couldn't. If you visualize a picture of a male veteran, he would be in his blazer, grey trousers, you know what I mean? You could visualize it, but it's really interesting that there is no sort of visual depictions of women. So it's really interesting that they feel missed out and left out. And so we managed to get some funding from the Department of Media, Sport and Culture, and that's how we were able to employ Paula, and through consultation groups with the women, looked at where the gaps in service were and designed a service specifically for them. Next one, please. So No Man's Land's the report. You can go on the Forward Assist website, the link's there, and I think this gets circulated at the end of this presentation anyway. Have a read of that report. It's very hard hitting. It is the lived experiences of 100 women, but well worth a read. And if you're into social work, I really think you need to read this so that you can support people that you would not normally have necessarily thought they came from a military background. Next, please. So we partnered with an organisation that they're experts in ethnographic research. We trained up 10 women veterans as peer researchers. They interviewed another 10 women each. That ended up with 100 women we interviewed. And over the course of that, we used a snowballing technique. So they would go out and a friend would tell a friend, and they would come and get interviewed. And the idea of ethnographic research, which I really like, is you're much more likely to tell a peer what's going on in your life and the issues that you're facing than perhaps you would some academic. So it's a fantastic way of working, and it's worked particularly well for us. So get ready to hold on to your seats as I rush through this next bit of the presentation. So demographics, age range of the people involved, 28 to 72. 64% of the women served at least 5 years, 42% were married, 37% had children at school, 66% of women were in employment at the time of interview. It breaks down quite simply. The vast majority of women we spoke to were from the Army. There was a few from the RAF and there was a few from the Navy, but predominantly this group were from Army. So key things to remember here, the UK military still do, always has done, is they recruit from areas of multiple deprivation. And because of that, you are going to get the issues that you will be seeing as you work in social work of neglect, abuse, etc. You know, it goes with the territory really in so much of the way, and especially in the work that you do in the social worker. A lot of the women said they left home to escape an abusive home environment, and 20% of the women, which is 100, so 20% was 20 women out of the 100 said they were in the care of the local authority. And a lot of the women left school without any formal qualifications as a career route. Next, please. A lot of the women were really proud to have served their country. Several of them had really distinguished careers. However, there was quite a few of them felt they were really struggled in a male-dominated world, and even while they were serving, felt that they were outsiders and micromanaged. And then we were asking about trauma, because I thought originally the trauma would be the fact that a lot of the women had served in conflict zones, Northern Ireland and Iraq and Afghanistan. But when we said trauma, what the women came back and told us that 73% said they'd experienced sexual discrimination, 52% that said they'd been sexually assaulted while serving in the military, 49% had suffered emotional trauma, and 66% of the women interviewed that they reported that they'd experienced bullying. Of the women interviewed, 26% said they'd been physically assaulted whilst in the military, and nearly half alleged they'd suffered emotional trauma. 66% of the women said that they'd had a personal experience of bullying. And 25 individuals that reported that they'd seen it and didn't do anything. And now we're starting to get the moral injury bit, because you join in the military because you think it's this wonderful, fabulous environment, and then you're finding out it's not quite what you thought it was going to be. So the ones who were sexually assaulted were going, well, this is really difficult for me to cope with. It's like a form of betrayal. And then you're starting to get like this thing about like, well, I'm colluding with this bad practice and I shouldn't, and people start feeling really bad, and they struggle with that many years afterwards. One of the things I pointed out, only 11 of the interviewees felt that there was any safeguarding procedures in the military, because the military it governs itself. It's got a military police force, and it very rarely goes outside of that to the civilian police force for advice and guidance. So there's a key issue here, and they also felt 85% really felt they'd been treated differently than the male counterparts. Next, please. So 40% of the women decided to leave due to trauma-related stress. That's a phenomenal figure. And 72% of the women interviewed that the current transitional support is not fit for purpose. And that's because traditionally, all the services are designed for men. So anyone leaving, they'll put you on a building course or a paper and decorating or a construction course. And a lot of the women didn't want to go into that. Some did. So a lot of the women didn't want to go into those occupations. So you'd find like uniforms were designed for men, helmets are designed for men, protective body armor is designed for men. And so the women are expected to sort of make do and wear this clothing, which again gives them this feeling of not being valued and not really nearly mattering. And one of the really fascinating bits was the women who'd suffered military sexual trauma, which is a term the UK government and the MOD have not yet adopted, although our friends in America and Canada and Australia have, didn't want to join military groups and associations in case they met the perpetrator. So that isolates you even more. And as that last line says, 95% after the left said they felt invisible, isolated and forgotten, which again, from a moral injury standpoint, is a really worrying situation. Next. So I'm going to hand over to Paula now. And Paula's going to take you over and explain what military sexual trauma is, because for many of you, it's probably a term you've never heard of before. And over to you, Paula.
Thank you, Tony. And sorry, everyone, if I keep coughing. I've got a really bad chest and the sniffles, so you'll probably hear that all the time now. So military sexual trauma is an experience and not a diagnosis. Anyone can experience military sexual trauma regardless of the gender, although statistically the data that is out there demonstrates that it's usually experienced by more women than men. And there's lots of cultural issues as well around military sexual trauma and what actually happens to survivors while they're in the military. So, for example, reporting a sexual assault is often viewed as betrayal by the entire unit. So ultimately, this means that they're often made to be an outcast. They don't get any help or support. They're really vulnerable. They're worried if it's going to happen again, because at the end of the day, the women are actually going to work with the perpetrator. So they are often facing the person who raped them day in and day out with no safe place to go, no one to talk to, no investigation, and they just feel really isolated and really scared. Next slide, please. So the long-term impact of military sexual trauma is vast and can span the rest of that person's life. And it can usually take up to 10 years for somebody to come forward who sustained trauma to ask for help. So 10 years is a long time for somebody to live with really poor mental health problems. So there are many physical health diagnoses associated with military sexual trauma. And the most common ones are chronic pain, so lower back pain and headaches, gastro problems, so irritable bowel syndrome, lots of gynae problems, so menstrual disorders and pelvic pain, really feeling tired a lot of the time, autoimmune disorders and high blood pressure, and of course multiple and complex biological mental illnesses as well as psychological disorders. And the mixture of those two together really make women start engaging in risk-taking behaviour and suicidal ideation. So there's a lot of complexity going on for the women, and it really impacts on every part of the life as well. Over to you, Tony.
Next slide, please. So in the USA, women are sadly 2 times more likely than non-veteran women to die by suicide. And the research is, there's not an awful lot of research, but they are slowly but surely making the correlation between military sexual trauma, those unresolved issues Paula talked about after service, and there's a real concern, because in America you've got easy access to guns, and that's how the women are actually killing themselves, which is a real worry. And we've not seen that over here yet, but there isn't enough research over here to actually determine what is happening with women. But in America, one of the key areas that they've actually shown up is, if you get there's 3 areas here. So if you join up and you've got adverse childhood experiences prior to you joining, and then when you get into the military, you've got some form of military sexual traumas happened, you've been re-traumatized, and then post-service, if you end up in a relationship where there's, as we call it, domestic violence, the Americans call it intimate partner violence, which I prefer actually, then if you've got all these 3, this has been shown to be a huge flag of a real concern for when women in particular are at risk of suicide. So what I'd like to say is, like, you know, we shouldn't be minimizing any of this bullying, harassment, or sexual assault. This has really some horrendous outcomes if we don't actually start to look at the issues and ask some questions. So back to you, Paula. Thank you.
So as I spoke about before, the issues are multiple and complex, and it really impacts on the person's psychology, physical health, cognition, social relationships, staying in employment, lots of emotional dysregulation stuff going on, a lot of social withdrawal and trying to keep themselves safe and not going out, a lot of physical health problems. But the thing that I find the most concerning is the level of emotional difficulties that the women have. So they have lowered emotional intelligence. So they really struggle to understand how to ask for a simple thing, how to say no, how to protect themselves. They suffer a lot of shame and guilt. So it's so complex, and working with the women's really difficult because they have so many trust issues. So it takes a long time to get the women to open up, to then start talking about the range of things that's going wrong for them. Next slide, please. So as Tony was talking about before, Salute set up a range of different services, and what's been really exciting about going in lockdown is, beforehand I was really, well, I'm not that old, but an old-fashioned kind of therapist, and I really felt you had to work with people face to face, so you could read body language and eye movements and all of that kind of stuff. But since moving everything virtual, I've completely changed my mind totally. So all of the services that we have now are easily accessible. Women who have children can fit it into their day far easier. Women don't have to travel long distances to get help and support. They're being seen in a timely way, so they're getting access to services pretty much the same day. So these are the services that we provide. So domestic violence, training, counselling, conflict management, leadership, suicide prevention. And we also provide childcare as well. A lot of the women said that a barrier to access and help was that all of the services that are out there in the community don't take into consideration that to access counselling, And if you're a single parent, you might not have any childcare. So we provide childcare so that women can get help and support. Next slide, please. So, sorry. All of the women that we work with have all said pretty much the same thing. So the women want access services that are trauma informed. So that means they need access to service that doesn't re-traumatize them. They want a service that's led by women for women, because ultimately they want to feel safe, because most of them haven't felt safe for the majority of their life. Most women feel like the childhood trauma doesn't matter. They feel like the military service doesn't matter. And they feel like the trauma doesn't matter at all, and neither did the discharge into the civilian world. So ultimately, they feel like they have no sense of belonging or purpose. And many of the women have described symptoms of moral injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, complex PTSD, low self-esteem, trust issues, shame, guilt, and many of them lack confidence. That's over to you, Tony.
So one of our key things here is we made some recommendations in the report. We haven't really got very far on a lot of them actually, but one of the key things was there's now it's been around about a year to have a Department of Veterans Affairs, which is the first time in the UK, and we were saying they should have a specific women's department in there. That hasn't happened yet, but we'll keep campaigning. And an understanding, and a bit, that's why it's great to be speaking to you people today, so that there is a real issue that everybody needs to understand, that a woman's transition from the military is different than a man's. There's some similarities, but they are unique to women. And the other thing is, we were arguing and campaigning for the fact that military sexual trauma and moral injury should be acknowledged and screened for women, but probably beforehand if it was adverse childhood experiences, and afterwards, so services can be introduced to women to help them and support them in civilian life. So this needs huge collaborative effort to actually pull this together. But I think the police, the civilian police and the military police working together, and we're campaigning for the fact that if somebody's raped on campus, that the civilian police investigate it rather than the military police, just to make sure that there's some justice there. Because a lot of the women we've spoke to have said this hasn't happened. And again, as Paula said, psychological, not profiling, but we could actually cater for people joining the military. If they'd had adverse childhood experiences, they could go to roles in the military where they're unlikely to be re-traumatized by the service. And we need to think there's a lot more thinking needs to do that. So Defence Committee, pretty simple. We've just been talking at that since Paula did some with regards to women leave the military. I did with regards to the Armed Forces Bill. And with regards to the women, there was 4,200 women submitted their stories to Sarah Atherton, who's the MP who is leading on that. 40% of them were still service, 60% were veterans. 90 different organisations submitted the evidence, and that started, people have realised, well, actually, there is an issue here and we need to address it. And the fact that I did one the other day and I was talking about the impact of military sexual trauma on men. So we've got a research paper about to come out soon, and that looks at moral injury as well. And again, these will all be available on the website. So we're campaigning really hard. We're trying to raise awareness of the needs of this hidden population and this difficult subject matter. But the only way we're going to be able to do it is by actually addressing it. Next slide. So over to you. Do you want me to do this, Paula, or you?
No, it's all right. I was just joking before. One of the things that Tony hasn't mentioned from the inquiry is there was over 4,200 submissions, but 6 out of 10 of those women who sent in the stories experienced sexual harassment as well as high levels of MST. So 6 out of 10, I think those are really shocking statistics. So what can we do to help? What we need to do is we need to develop and use a good screening tool that asks the question in a compassionate way. So it asks a woman, did you serve in the military? And what kind of trauma did you experience? We need to use trauma-informed principles to ensure that women are not re-traumatized or made to feel that the victim blamed, because a lot of women who've accessed services before they've come to us feel like they've been asked questions that weren't sensitive, that weren't trauma-informed, and it triggered them. And then that became a barrier to accessing further help and support. So there needs to be some standards. And a really good idea is also to follow up after a disclosure and provide support to that person. A lot of people get asked a question, but then nothing's put in place to support that person. There's no one there to help them deal with the thoughts in a safe way. So we need to do a lot of follow-up work to make sure that that woman can contain her own psychology. And I think that's our presentation done, isn't it? Yep.
Fabulous. Fabulous. Thank you. Thanks, Paula and Tony. I know your contact details are on there, and you've talked about the website and what's available on the website, and we'll send out some links to that. I don't know, because I'm doing the screen sharing tonight, I don't know what's in the chat or in the questions, but I think I've just been able to pop up some questions here. So am I okay asking you the questions? I've not read them myself even yet, but they're still there. So I'm thinking, is that all right if I ask you these questions at this point? Is that all right, Tony? Yeah. So, okay. So it says, one question, Tony says, Tony, it does say Tony, so it's directed to you, but it says, Tony, I'm curious as to whether there's been consideration to partners of veterans around moral injury, such as a high rate of domestic violence committed to partners of serving personnel. So this might have a direct correlation to the views perceived as the norm within the old-fashioned views of serving personnel. It happens,
Yeah.
Therefore it's okay at home too type of thought process.
No, and there was a recent report out, actually. You look at the Forces in Mind Trust, Andrew Sellers, I can't remember the name, has just done a really good report which highlights the issue of domestic violence for partners, spouses, and family members. And it's an issue, yeah. And yeah, domestic violence is an issue in the military. It's an issue after the military as people get divorced and split up, and there's a real issue around moral injury there, you know, where people have been supportive, followed people all around the world, and then feel that the relationships ended and it's been really difficult. And again, just like moral injury, military sexual trauma, survivor guilt, whatever different terms we use with it, these are areas where we really need to open up a new landscape. And I for one, have been, and I wrote about it in Professional Social Work magazine, believe that social workers should actually be leading on care coordination for the military and their families, and especially veterans after service, because I think we've got all the skills to put things in place and keep everyone safe. And I think we are the expertly placed for it, but sadly we don't seem to have a role in it for veterans, which is a tragedy.
You see, I think that's fascinating, Tony, because I know the conversations we've had before about you talking about how social work should be taking a lead in this. But what I'm finding from talking to you is how much I'm learning that I can use in social work that I can take from your experiences in the military. So even if you're not working with veterans, I think listening to things tonight are actually really helpful for us in terms of, you know, I liked your being, belonging, becoming. I was thinking actually we could use that in all kinds of places.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm a big fan of trans theoretical studies. I've got a friend in America and we call ourselves the theoretical vandals, because we'll take these interventions and these models and we'll change them for the particular groups we're working with. I couldn't agree with you more. It's crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose I've started off tonight talking about moral injury as it might apply to social workers, but then you're talking about moral injury as it's applying to veterans. And as you were talking, Tony, I mean, because I'd not heard your presentation, you hadn't heard my presentation, so we just brought them together. But I was thinking about, you know, the United Nations has talked a lot about how women have been really significantly impacted differentially to men from home-based working. So I was talking earlier about how home-based working is bringing more moral injury risks to social workers, but then, you know, the women angle coming in. So there are so many different kind of connectors between what we were talking about. And that takes us to this question that I'm thinking, I'm hoping you and I can answer, but I'm not sure we can answer it affirmatively. But anyway, here's the question. It says, does Social Work England have a code or policy that a social worker can use to seek permission from their manager to be accepted from dealing with a triggering event or condition, just like the NMC does for nurses? Now, I didn't know the NMC did that for nurses, but that's really interesting.
Well, when I was a probation officer, we could opt not to work with sex offenders if it was going to trigger us. Which I thought was really forward thinking at the time. And I think, see, these are great conversations when it comes to practice. And I think people should have those options, because it's not a reflection on it's actually a very wise decision on behalf of the individual who's saying, I might have difficulty with this. And I don't think you have to disclose why, actually. I just think you need to say, I'm going to struggle with this. So that's fascinating. I think it should be.
There is guidelines for it, so it should be within the supervision policies. I know that social workers I used to work with who had suffered adverse childhood experience, if there was somebody that was coming in that was triggering them, we used to talk about it in group supervision and then one-to-one supervision, and that worker wouldn't then work with that person. And therapists do it. You're right, the NMC do it. Occupational therapists do it, so it's definitely there.
I think that's really interesting, Paula, the fact that I didn't know there was something in the NMC, and as far as I'm aware, and I will undertake to check this out and just make sure it's clear in the follow-up email, but as far as I'm aware, there is nothing in the Social Work England standards that says that you have a right to opt out. And it's an interesting one, because we're going to do a future webinar actually about how much of yourself you share as a social worker, and your own experiences of trauma will come into that. And I think that's something that we would like to follow up as a team. I think it's a really good question. I love your answers. I think it's an individual supervisor's response to that, as opposed to something that Social Work England have done. I might have that wrong, so I'm not going to tell you I know that for a fact. But having looked at Social Work England standards, I really don't think there is something there that says you have that right. I think it's a uniquely individual thing. And I think some organisations provide really good, therapeutically based group supervision, reflective intervision, that kind of thing. And other organisations simply don't. Supervision becomes much more, what have you done? How many cases can you take on this week? As opposed to looking at those sorts of issues. I don't know what your thoughts are, Tony, on that, if you have any more on that.
Well, the problem is, I think, and I've experienced it, and it's all very well having the principle and the guidelines, if you like, but I think it should be a little bit more than that, because I remember on a couple of occasions when I was asked, I was on duty officer, and there wasn't anybody else who could pick the cases up, and then you just have to do it anyway, which sort of, there's a bit of moral injury for you. And when you've got something agreed that you don't have to work with a particular offender at the time it was, but the needs of the service had to come first, and so it is difficult. It is but I think it's a great thing. I think that's the very thing I get excited about. I think champion these causes such as this. I think everybody should have the right to go, no, on this particular instance it would be too much, with no negative consequences for saying that. I would applaud somebody saying that to me.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? We're all human beings, really, and it's about how to connect with other human beings. But I think what you've shared with us tonight is fascinating. So thank you so much to Tony and Paula. I mean, even just the conversations we were having earlier, you know, around, for example, women not having access to sanitary, you know, in when you're serving, not being able to go, you can't pop to the shops in Afghanistan, can you, to buy yourself some sanitary towels? And I'd never even thought of that for women on the front line, and yet actually that's something that's a really significant issue. So I really agree with you, Tony. Just having a social work oversight of human rights within military service, really, that's what it's about, isn't it? So
yeah, and you know what it is, and it's not just this country. It's like after that got a U-turn, after Paula raised it at Parliament, there was an article in the Telegraph that said, oh, the women in the Swiss army are now going to be issued with female underwear. So ever since World War II, they've been issued with men's underpants. And it's like, how is this oversight happening that people are not going, that look, there's some unique needs here, and we shouldn't be just issuing women with men's clothes? As one of our colleagues pointed out, the men would be so soon moaning if they were asked to wear women's dresses, wouldn't they, if, you know, when they go out. So it's like, it's really quite odd. It's really odd.
Yeah, it's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And the role for social work, I think, is really
huge role for social work.
Because I think in other countries they have a lot more, don't they?
Well, America, you train up to MSc level and you specialize in social work, just working with veterans and counseling and support. And I've visited, if you want to Google it, look at your US University of Southern California. They've got a specific veterans program. And in the University of William and Mary, which we visited with Paula in 2019, they've got a counseling course that is specific for social workers at MSc level, counseling veterans and their families. It's that specific because the issues are multiple and complex, and I just really believe you know, social workers are ahead of the hunt, for want of a better term here, on understanding the issues and how people have to fit in back into society when the service has ended.
Yeah, I just think it's fascinating. And this whole, you know, kind of idea around moral injury that in many ways I just fell into because I read an article, you know, just one article, and it started me thinking. And I suppose in a way that's a message for lots of students, isn't it, that are in the audience now, that sometimes you read an article and it sparks an interest and it really can take you into something really fascinating and interesting. And I do know, for example, that at least 2 students have contacted me to say that they are doing their dissertation as part of their degree about moral injury because they've become really interested in it now.
Fabulous.
So, you know, I think it's fascinating that we're using this concept that we're taking from the military. We can now think about how it applies to ourselves, but maybe that will also encourage us to see that reciprocal relationship of what is social work doing in working with veterans, and how are we reaching out much more. And you don't have to be specifically working with veterans, do you? If you're working in domestic violence, there are going to be issues around veterans. If you're working with children and families, there's going to be veterans that you're working with in families. If you're working with older people, there's going to be veterans that you're working with. Whoever you're working with, veterans are going to come into this role, aren't they?
Well, yeah, and it's homeless sector, drug and alcohol sector, mental health sector, you name it, there's a veteran there somewhere. And then you've got to unpack, you've got to peel back that onion skin to actually find out where the traumas were, and then hopefully get the support they need. I've never been so enthralled with the topic in my life. Every year I find something else and go, this is unbelievable. Unbelievable. It's a fascinating topic.
It is. But also, I've got to say, Tony, you're a fascinating guy, just sitting as a social worker thinking, nobody's doing this. I'm going to set up a social work organisation that does it. And I think that has to be inspirational to everybody in the audience as well. Just, so I just also want to say that as well. So, and thank you both for joining us. Thank you, Paula. Good luck for when Salute Her gets your own charity status. And I think your research is it's amazing. I've read No Man's Land and I was just fascinated as I read it. I mean, when I say fascinated, I was distressed at times as well. That it is a distressing piece of research, but really important research. So thank you both very much for joining us. I don't know if there's, because I can't see the chat, I don't know if there's anything in the chat. So if the team feel there's anything that we need to be conscious of, or you need to bring to the attention of Tony and Paula, please let us know.
Just lots of thanks, and people reflecting on their own experiences of being in the army and the transition out back into civvy life. But people just saying it was really interesting having you both on. They really appreciated you coming. Yeah, and it's been wonderful. That's it. It's just been loads and loads. It's a screed of thank yous, basically.
That's very kind indeed. And if anybody wants to, you can get our details on the website. If anybody wants to ask us anything, or if anyone's got a special, those two people you said were studying moral injury, I've got some great connections in Canada and Australia who are leading the way on this, and I'd be happy to connect people with academics abroad.
Well, I was going to say, hopefully next year the Winston Churchill Fund will reopen, and I'm hoping to apply to that. You can apply to that if you're British, I should say. Sorry for all of our other people, all our international folks. Sorry, and I'm thinking this could be quite an interesting piece of research, how other countries do moral injury.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, no, that's you guys have been brilliant. Just from a personal view, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. And so I'm just going to let people know what we've got coming up, because you know that we always just let you know what's coming up, and then Dave and the team will put into the chat the links so that you can register now to attend next week. So next week's session is a back to basics. We're going to be looking at share as a model of social work. But I've got to tell you, I am so excited by this session, because I don't think, well, I've certainly never seen it before, but we're going to be joined by Joe and Prospera, who have both joined us at previous webinars, but the three of us wrote developed the share model. We're going to present the model, but then we're going to be joined by two social workers and also someone who they support. And so they're going to talk to us from the perspective of a practice educator and a student and a person receiving services about how they used the model. Now, I don't think I've ever seen that kind of group of people coming together, the people that develop the model, people using the model in the practice, and people who are receiving services based around that model. Don't think I've ever seen it done before. Whether it works or not, I don't know. You'll have to come and see next week when we've put it together. But that's the session next week, share. The following session, we'll be looking at good report writing, assessments. We're going to follow the same kind of format that we had for the essay writing webinar, because that was really good. So we're going to have lots of different people join us with top tips. So we've got team managers, we've got principal social worker, we've got social workers, we've got all kinds of people coming to tell us about their top tips for report writing. And then the week after that, we'll be looking at imposter syndrome, which will be based on our team, Social Work Student Connect team members' personal experiences of being newly qualified and experiencing imposter syndrome. But it carries on for the rest of your career, honestly. So it's going to be relevant for everybody. So that's our next few weeks. But also, don't forget that we are going to have a huge virtual graduation. We are meeting every weekend about this. It's so exciting. The stuff we've got planned, the things we're going to do. It's so exciting. And Tony and Paula have said they're going to join us, because every time anybody comes, the team invite them. It's going to be a great night, because we know social work students last year and this year have missed out on a graduation. So there's going to be prizes. There's going to be all kinds of different things going on that night. But we will only be able to have so many people join us live. Other people, it's going to be live streamed too. So we would encourage you to register now to come along and join us. So we're asking you to register well ahead. And it also means that we can cater in terms of the things that we're going to do as well on the night. So it just remains for me to once again thank Tony and Paula very much for joining us tonight. Thanks to all the team as well for the usual technical issues and dealing with the chat and everything else. So thank you very much, and good night, everybody.